Hello everyone and welcome to Berkshire Environmental Action Today. I'm your host Bruce Winn, President of Berkshire Environmental Action Team. And with me today is Jim Murphy, Community Involvement Coordinator for Region 1 of EPA. And we're going to be talking about the Housatonic River and the cleanup of PCBs. Thank you for coming, Jim.
My pleasure.
I guess what we should start with is just a little catch-up on how we got to this point.
Okay.
It all began long ago with GE's dumping of PCBs in the river.
Right. I think probably most of your viewers know that GE had a very large operation in Pittsfield for many years, working with PCBs and transformers, essentially without a whole lot of detail. PCBs were released on their property, either onto the ground, through drainage ways, etc., and eventually contaminated a lot of the property where the facility is, about a little over 250-acre area, and then found their way, many of the PCBs through oil, found its way to the Housatonic River. GE stopped operations, I guess for the most part, into the 70s, and then by the I guess mid-90s, they were pretty much done, other than their GE Plastics operation. But they stopped using PCBs a number of years back.
Yeah, but the PCBs actually went farther afield than just the GE property, because there was fill that was used as fill for parks, schools, residential properties, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there has been a big effort to remove PCBs from those properties. Most of that is complete. There's still some work going on at the GE facility, but as far as the residential properties that were identified, the state of Massachusetts, Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection has been the lead regulatory agency working with GE and the property owners in cleaning up the PCBs that found their way off the facility.
So eventually, when there is a determination of just how this cleanup will proceed, it's going to be EPA's decision with input from a number of stakeholders.
Correct.
But you have to work within constraints, and one of those constraints is everybody's heard about the consent decree.
Right. Now, the consent decree was, to step back just a little bit, GE had been working with the state for a number of years in beginning to address the PCB contamination. In the late 70s, EPA got involved and with the intent of listing the GE facility on the National Superfund list, the National Priorities list, as it's called. GE was not in favor of that. A number of community leaders were also not in favor of it. There was a fairly robust discussion at the time. GE and EPA, as well as the state of Massachusetts and the state of Connecticut, negotiated a settlement which resulted in this consent decree. Now, under the consent decree, it was very prescriptive about how GE was going to address their former facility property, as well as GE addressing the first half mile of the Housatonic River that ran through the plan area, down essentially from Newell Street to Lyman Street, I believe. They remediated that essentially through dredging, removing contamination along the banks and some additional work. And then EPA did the next mile and a half of the river down to the confluence where the east and west branch come together at Fred Garner Park. So those were the two parts that were prescribed in the consent decree. As far as what was going to be done with what got the name at the time, the rest of the river, I think it was, what are we going to be doing with the rest of the river? There wasn't really enough time to negotiate all that, plus we really didn't have all the data. So what was established in the consent decree was a process for cleaning up the rest of the river. And that process is where we are now. What has happened first, since the consent decree was negotiated for a while, it was signed, I believe, around 2000, 2001, that time frame. Since then, there has been extensive sampling of the river and of the floodplain surrounding the river over those years. And once we had the data, then we got to the step where GE produced what's called a corrective measures study. And what that is essentially a document that says we know where all this contamination is now. These are the ways that are feasible to address it, and there were a range of options in there. So I'll stop with, so that's essentially how the consent decree went. And it governs really the relationship between GE and EPA and the state regulators, but it also carved out a role for the public. In all of EPA's cleanup programs, we really put a value on involvement from the community, being able to provide all the information that's being exchanged between EPA and GE, as well as it set up the Citizens Coordinating Council, which is a citizen advisory group that was meeting on a monthly basis. It still meets on a regular basis in order for us to have both GE and EPA to go have a focal point for the community that we can provide information and get feedback. We try to gather feedback in additional ways, but that's the one that was officially set up through the consent decree.
Mm-hmm. Now, to what extent do you think we can use the first 2 miles as a model for what's going to happen in the rest of the river? Because when I look at what that river looks like now, for instance, if you look south from the Newell Street Bridge,
right.
It looks, there's almost no sign that there was a remediation that took place.
Right.
And if you sample, I know that now sampling of invertebrates has taken place in that stretch, and the PCB level has been reduced by 99.5%. Mm-hmm. So basically we have, the base of the food chain has been cleaned up, right. which is good news for trout fishermen and what have you.
Right.
To what extent can we expect that kind of result in the rest of the river?
Well, we're hoping that we're going to get a very similar result, in that we're going to get most of the PCBs, prevent them from reaching the food chain. Now, I think looking at the rest of looking at the first 2 miles that were done, you know, if you look at the first half mile, as you said, you know, starting at Newell Street, if you looked at it right now, you wouldn't really notice that there was a remediation there. Mm-hmm. The foliage has grown back. The area was rip-wrapped, meaning rip-wrap are those large, very light-colored stones, which have created a aesthetic type of issue for that we've heard over and over again.
They look like the kind of stones people would put in their backyards if they also like the pink flamingos. It's kind of
could be, yes. There are. Excuse me. You know, they're fairly large stones, and the reason that they were used in that section of the river, the first 2 miles, is that was the Housatonic River. It's really an urban river there. It's mm-hmm. running through the GE facility. It's running by a number of businesses whose property goes right up to the river and down the banks, as well as residential properties. Now, when we were addressing the contamination there, we really didn't have the luxury of you know, excavating the banks and then laying them back and taking people's yards or taking businesses' parking lots or so mm-hmm. on. People didn't want to lose their property. So when we did our excavation, we then placed these large stones in there to essentially anchor all of the cap, the clean area that we installed after removing contamination. We used them around bridges and roads, you know, just to essentially protect the integrity of the infrastructure of the river as it ran through Pittsfield. So, as far as you know, what people see, what they saw in the first 2 miles of the river, it's going to be a much different view of things, or things will look much different in the next 8 miles or wherever the remediation is done. As people know, the river is then you know, running through wildlife area mm-hmm. And area that's really, you know, really that people are not living. So we will have the ability to address the banks differently. You know, around some of the bridges, we probably will end up using riprap again, just to hold the you know, hold the roads in place. If we have a soft restoration, it's not as you know, the infrastructure would not be as secure.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to dwell on the 2 miles that have already been done, but one of the things that seems problematic in that 2 miles is the fact that we have Silver Lake, we have Uncommit Brook, that are still leaching and sending PCBs into the river, and that part of the river is part of the 2 miles that's already been cleaned up.
Correct.
And also on Merrill Road, we have the pump and clean station that is basically sucking up groundwater, removing PCBs, and pumping the cleaned water into the river. But it's not 100% efficient, so that actually is sending some PCBs in. Am I right? So is what?
Well, I don't know the details about the pump and are you talking about the pump and treat for the groundwater facility?
Yeah,
okay,
that's right.
Yeah, I can't speak today to exactly how much of the contamination is taken out in the treatment facility. My guess is it's a very high percentage. But the two things you mentioned, Silver Lake and Uncomet Brook, are still really the major areas that still need to be addressed associated with the GE facility. Now we've been, and it would make sense, you would think you clean upstream first, you know, and move down the river, and that's essentially the approach we're going to be taking with the rest of river. Both Silver Lake and Uncomet Brook are going to, the active cleanup will start. Silver Lake is going to start this year. Uncomet Brook, I believe, is the following year. But by the time we actually get to start the rest of river cleanup, those 2 things will have been completed. So it will stop that, you know, the PCBs from coming from those 2 sites. Excuse me. And again, there was, you know, a lot of work has gone on, and we did have to sequence it in some way. You know, people may disagree, thinking we should have done Silver Lake and Uncomet Brook much earlier. But we really wanted to start addressing, or have GE start addressing the river right away. So, you know, that's just the way things ended up.
Well, with the rest of the river now, below that first 2-mile section, right. I know that a lot of decisions haven't been made yet, and it's still in the works. But I think one decision that has been made, if I'm, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it would put a lot of minds at ease, is that we're not going to be having any dumps in Berkshire County, any waste dumps in Berkshire County.
Right.
The material is being dredged out as a result of the cleanup, won't be stored here, except maybe temporarily, but then it's going to be sent out on rail. Is that correct?
Well, I know that that's important to a lot of people in the Berkshires. You know, where we are now in the process is that in the last 2 weeks, EPA in the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts have put out what we're calling our approach. So it's kind of a preview of what's going to be in our formal proposal, which will be called a proposed plan, which we hope to get out this summer. You know, we've said this many times, and we keep slipping, but we're really shooting to get that out in July this year. That will be a formal proposal that will be much more specific. As far as what decisions we'll make, we're not going to make any decision until we have that formal proposal out, have a good time period to hear back from community members and stakeholders, GE among them, about what they think of our proposal. Based on feedback, we would then make any adjustments we see as necessary based on the feedback. And then at that point, we would announce our final cleanup decision. Now, just looking at the calendar, if we get that out in July, you know, typically we would start out with 45-day comment period, which would take us into September. My guess is people are going to ask for an extension, which, because it's such a large document that's coming out after 10 years of study, that people are going to want a little bit more time to look at it. You know, we could extend that to 60 days or thereabouts. So now we're into the fall. Once we close the public comment period, EPA will then take the time to respond to all the comments. So if we get hundreds or 1,000 comments, it's going to take us longer to write them all. You know, we will incorporate what we see as appropriate into our plan, but things we don't incorporate, we will address in writing at the time that we issue our decision. So the decision is probably, you know, now you're looking out at 2013. But back to your point about the off-site landfills is what we did say in our paper that we put out 2 weeks ago was essentially that our best thinking is that the waste should be shipped to licensed facilities. that are licensed to take PCBs. There are none in the Berkshires, so I think that's kind of good news for people. You know, we haven't said where it should go. We just said it should go to a licensed facility, which essentially means out of the Berkshires. We think rail makes sense for many reasons. It doesn't mean that there won't be a lot of truck traffic and some construction impacts, and we could talk a little bit more about that. But that, you know, this certainly would be less if you're actually shipping out a fair amount of contaminated sediments out of the area.
Sure. Now, at that same informational meeting that you had just recently,
right.
I was surprised that it sounded like what's still on the table is the idea of capping not just at Woods Pond, but in the river itself.
Right.
Is that, in fact, still on the table?
That is. You know, there are a few, I don't know what the number is of PCBs that are out, or how many acres and so on are in the floodplain. It varies. You know, they're at different depths, but in some areas of the floodplain as well as the river, they're very deep, and it would really be, you know, close to impossible to try to remove all of the PCBs from the system from the floodplain and the river. And what we will be trying to do is dredge out some amount of PCBs wherever we're going to be, whether it's the floodplain or the river. Dredge out some amount and then replace it with clean soil or a clean cap. And when we're talking about a cap, we're talking about soil. We're talking about some amount of a habitat layer, so that, you know, kind of the critters can reestablish themselves in the river, and also some kind of I don't want to say armoring in the river bed. In some cases, it may be a hard armor beneath the cap. In other places, you know, we don't exactly know. That's something that will be determined in a design phase, and that's something that GE takes the lead on. You know, under working with EPA and the state agencies. You know, we would need to approve anything that they do propose. But essentially, the idea, the purpose of the cap is to prevent any PCBs from coming back up into the river. So it's going to be a substantial cap. You know, one of the things, design elements that was in the corrective measures study that GE had proposed in some areas was a thin layer cap, which is about a 6-inch layer of sand. Our cap is going to really be a much more substantial cap that will, you know, be designed to withstand some serious storm events, for one thing. So that's, you know, it's something that's been used around the country at major EPA cleanup sites, Superfund sites, and a good number of other rivers. And we think it's you know, a proven technology, as proven as any technology can be. That, you know, we've really been in the cleanup business now for 40 years or so. You know, as far as landfills, caps on landfills, caps on rivers, you know, anything that we build needs to be maintained. So whatever work we do, part of the final decision and agreement with GE will be that it needs to be maintained essentially into a perpetuity, that there will be, we will establish a regular cycle of inspections, you know, sampling, etc., to make sure that whatever work is done is maintained, that it stays in place. Yeah.
I think my own feeling on that is that all caps eventually fail, especially if you have it in moving water, such as the river. Right. But it sounds like maybe there are two different uses of the word cap here. Cap to cover and confine PCBs that you see as problematic, and you don't want them to come back up.
Correct.
Or, in a second sense, which is what I thought I heard you say the first time, you dredge down, dig out everything that you think is problematic. You can't get everything, and there's some residual amount back there. And even though you think it's not problematic and you're going to put a cap on top of that. So whatever you leave, you're always going to put a cap. But my feeling about the first use of the word cap, which might be what you mean, is that especially in a moving river, you know, you're always going to have that cap in danger of being disrupted. And in Woods Pond, where I believe there's also the possibility of using a cap, that was the one place that I thought everyone agreed it was safe to just dredge. what's going on at Woods Pond?
Well, Woods Pond, I think what was in our status document, as it was called, and for the listeners or the viewers, on our web page, which is www.epa.gov/NE for New England, /again GE, and I would assume that you can probably get that up on the screen. That if you go right on that first page of the website, there'll be a link to this document that I'm talking about, and it talks about our approach for different parts of the river. We call them different reaches, as well as Woods Pond. And Woods Pond, we are envisioning some amount of dredging, certainly not to get everything out of there. We think that going down a number of feet will enhance the ability of the pond to act as a sediment trap. Where one of the concerns we have is if we're really looking at stopping the primary remediation work at Woods Pond. We're also looking at some impoundments further down. One of the concerns we have is transport of PCBs that are in the water column past Woods Pond, and that's something that's been watched and measured over the years. We think the cleaning and capping in the river, in conjunction with essentially establishing a sediment trap in Wood Pond will prevent more from going downstream. So again, in Woods Pond, I'm not sure what the exact depth of the contamination is, but I know it's 10 feet more than that of sediment. Pulling that all out, we don't think is necessary. We think it makes sense to pull out a number of feet and then put a couple of foot protective cap in. Well,
I think especially in the river, we're going to have to disagree on this one, because I think capping isn't going to be successful. I think Ellen Brockovich, in that movie that I don't even remember now, but it was there. She was back in the news, I think, last year, because part of her success story was that what was finally decided was part of this, I think it was chromium, was going to be confined with a liner. Now I know that's different than a cap, but again, she was back in the news because it is ripped, it's broken, and it's allowing seepage through. And I think that's what we're going to find with caps, with liners, and that sort of thing, that it's a temporary fix. And my concern is that with a cap, when it finally does fail, we're going to be past the point of GE's financial responsibility, and then we're going to have to pick up the tab. Is that?
Well, we might be getting a little bit beyond my expertise as far as a consent decree, but I believe GE is really responsible in perpetuity. Now, when we have essentially landfills with caps on them, the responsible party is really responsible, kind of forever, and that's one of the considerations. And does it make more sense for them to ship it away to a licensed facility someplace, or have their own landfill here, which they will be responsible for forever? If they can essentially get it to somebody else who's responsible for license and so on to maintain a landfill, then that's a long-term expense that's not on GE's books, or whoever a responsible party is who's responsible for maintaining a cap. And that's one of the things in the consent decree. There are a number of criteria. When we do put out our proposed plan, we will say that this shipping waste out of Berkshire County to a licensed facility makes sense to us for these reasons, whether it be cost or impacts on the community, or some of the other criteria that we have in a consent decree and in the permit. And again, you're saying it's nothing's going to last forever, and I will agree. I mean, I'll compare it more to.
Well, the one thing that would last forever is if you took the PCBs out.
Well, they would be someplace else, but they're never going. They're not going to disappear. Yeah. There are another topic maybe we could move on to is people have talked about alternative technology, but as far as a cap, I mean, if you look at it, your house, I don't know how old your house is, but You know, the house I lived in previously was 200 years old. It was very well maintained over the years. I spent a little bit too much time maintaining it myself. After 15 years, I was glad to get to a newer house. But it's the same thing. That would have fallen apart unless there were people there to watch it and maintain it. And that's really what we're talking about.
Well, I think we're running out of time. I think we could talk about this forever. And I'd love to have you back.
I would be happy to be back.
Okay, because I think we're getting to the good stuff.
Okay, great.
And so we'll have to do this again.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. And thanks to Berkshire Environmental Action today.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, everybody.